I want to thank BAND for this generous invitation to host this book launch today. To Karen and Claudia and Natalie and Ferry and all your board members and volunteers. Really appreciate this opportunity. BAND's early support of my 2016 exhibition, Newfoundland's project, exploring historical and contemporary links between Newfoundland and the Caribbean diaspora, who is really has led to this work. So I don't know if you realize that, but I really wanted to acknowledge that. I begin by honoring my mother, Adassa, and my father, Io Daly, and all of my ancestors whose struggle, resilience, strength, vision for the future has brought me to this point today. I grew up in St. John's, Newfoundland, and now live in Toronto, and as they mentioned, I'm an artist curator. Just weeks before the pandemic, I curated an exhibition called What Carries Us, Newfoundland and Labrador in the Black Atlantic, which sort of continued the themes that I had that had been explored with the earlier Newfoundlands project, looking at this interconnected history between Newfoundland and Labrador, Africa and the Caribbean, but from a diasporic perspective. At an artist talk that I did in the summer of 2020 with writer and academic Sonia Boom, I talked about the fact that growing up as a child in the Newfoundland school system, I didn't really learn how my history was connected. And I'm very grateful to Marnie Parsons from running the Goat Books and Broadsides in Torres Cove, Newfoundland, who was listening and who invited me to write a book about the exhibition. And the book, The Possible Lives of W.H. Saylor, grew out of that invitation. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about W.H., and then I'm going to half recite, half read the poem, because I don't quite have it memorized yet.
Not too much.
Not too much, yeah. Not too much. No. I just want to mention that in 1987, some folks were wandering along the Labrador coast, and they saw a coast that was eroding, and they saw some wood sticking out of a bank, and archaeologists were brought in to explore, and they exhumed a coffin. They opened it up, and inside the coffin were the remains of somebody, and so they sent off the skeletal remains were examined, a sample of the hair, and they determined that they were of a young black male, probably about 22 years of age when he died, and the remains date from about 1800. So that I discovered I won't get too much into that because I'm sure Dawn has questions related to that, but that's what led to this piece. So I'm going to get into it. I don't know your rightful name, and I don't know from whence you came. All I know is it's a shame that there's no one to claim your remains. I don't know your rightful name, and I don't know from whence you came, but it's time that you were laid to rest again. Some may say I've got no skin in the game, yet if it's really all the same, this child of the diaspora would like to claim you as kin. Coastal erosion takes the blame for making your 200-year-old coffin plain, buried with your head oriented east toward Africa to face your maker in peace. Laid to rest on the Strait of Belle Isle, you were young and short in stature, missing your forearm for that matter. Was this the factor that led to your demise? Your kinky hair and strong teeth, your knife, the shoes on your feet, the clothes that you wore, all are clues to who you were. Can your bones tell us more? Initials were carved into your shoe, knife, and pouch. What truths would you utter from your mouth if you could tell us your story, something of your history? We'll never know how you were made or on which ship you came. Maybe what was unearthed will give birth to a renaming, a reclaiming of dignity and worth. I will place a marker at the site where you lost your fight. Let it stand for all the black fathers and brothers who plied these waters, for all the unnamed mothers and daughters bound to plantations to suffer cruel trials and tribulations, fueling that trade in saltfish, sugar, molasses, rum, human beings for centuries upon centuries to come. I will give you the dignity and respect you deserve. Give us a voice to be heard, for it's time for you to be laid to rest again. What did you see as you traveled sea to shining sea, passing icebergs and fjords, rocky beaches and craggy shores, towering waves, shipwrecks, drownings, pulse racing, heart pounding? Were you awestruck by the mystery, by the sights and sounds of natural and human history? Egrets, gulls, seabirds, schools of fish, seals, polar bears, porpoises, humpbacks, killer whales, sharks, navigating the immensity? Did the depth and darkness of the oceans and the ever-changing sky mesmerize you as dugout canoes, punts, schooners, fishing boats, whaling ships, sailboats, steamboats, conveyors of people and goods charted their way through the water's blue? The sights, the sounds of nature's bounty juxtaposed with those of fishing, sealing, whaling, hunting, seafaring, and other human deeds. Captains steering vessels, shipmates furling and unfurling sails, fishermen pulling codfish-laden nets with ease. What was the land of your birth? And do you remember the color and smell of its earth? Were you born on West African soil, captured as a child and sold into slavery's toil, forcibly transported to the New World in the hold of a slave ship, that horrendous Middle Passage trip? Do you remember the wails and the cries? So much agony, so many lives lost. And did you cling to the memory of your mother's eyes, her scent, her caress, her laughter, her smile? And what did you carry with you? Or were you born on a plantation in the Caribbean or the American South? Did you cut sugarcane, pick cotton, plant rice through heavy rains, heat, and drought? Did you make your escape, attempt to get out by enlisting as a sailor in the British or American Navy? Must have taken a lot of courage and grit. Did you learn to live by your wits, and did you know how to lead with your fists? Or did you hail from much closer, perhaps the son of Nova Scotia, whose parents fought for England in the American Revolutionary War, promised lands on its distant, rocky shores, only to be given plots that were lifeless and poor? Did you fight in a battle like Trafalgar? And what was your experience of war? Did you fear for your life as the ship came under fire? Did you say a prayer as things became dire, until victory was gained, your opponent slain? And did you hear of the Haitian Revolution? Were you buoyed by the successful rebellion of slaves against colonial power? The first Black republic in the world, freedom flowered? And did you learn to read and write, to decipher maps, use navigational instruments and tools, let your imagination take flight? Did the ship's captain take a shine to you, let you hang out with the officers as they dined too? Did you have special status with the crew? Did they discriminate, or did they give you your due? Were you a free man or enslaved as you traversed the ocean waves? Did you learn to play an instrument? Could you sing? Did you gain skills like cutting hair, cooking, carpentry, or boxing in the ring? Did you carry ideas of democracy and freedom, ideas shared with your plantation-bound Black brothers and sisters when you encountered them? Did you father children, a son, a daughter? Perhaps you have living relatives, descendants who don't know what they're missing. All these things we can't possibly know. They have only made my curiosity grow about all the possible lives you may have lived. I don't know from whence you came, and I don't know your rightful name. But it's sorry, I don't know from whence you came, I don't know your rightful name, but you remain. Respect is due. It's time that you were laid to rest anew. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? It's fine? Okay. Bushra, that was just marvelous and so moving. Louder? Okay. Closer? How's that? Better? Okay. Yeah, that was so moving. And I just want to say spoken word too. You can do spoken word. What can't you do? That's my question. That's my first question. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I can just hear that being repeated ages and ages from now, children all over the world reading that, and adults, because to be honest, when I opened the book, I just couldn't believe the power of it. And I know it's a children's work, supposedly, but it really hit me as any full strength prose poem. It's just epic-like. So thank you. Thank you so much for that. First of all, yes, you were right. I want you to tell us in a little bit more detail about the discovery of W.H. Saylor. You said it was 87, because I guess I thought it was a bit earlier than that. Mm-hmm. Who discovered him, or was it one person that discovered? And what happened? What condition was he in? And what did they do with the remains, or how were the remains handled between that time and now?
Yes, so thank you for that question. Yeah. So what I learned was that in 1987, some folks were just out, walking along the shore,
okay,
coastal erosion, and they saw this, what looked like wood and maybe some fabric and other, stuff sticking out. And because this is the Labrador coast, it's quite ancient, right? So they sent a team of folks from Memorial University, an archaeologist named James Tuck, and they came and they dug out the coffin and they brought it, I guess, to the university. They opened it up and they saw these skeletal remains that were lying on sort of woolen padding. The skeleton was wearing a uniform. It was buried with some objects, a shoe, knife, a pouch, some other objects that sailors would use at that time. And they also had, because we don't lose our teeth and our hair, right? So there was a hair sample. They sent it off to the RCMP labs in Nova Scotia. They examined them and they said, this is clearly a black person. The skeleton was missing a forearm, so they thought maybe that was the cause of death. There were other things that they surmised, and I guess since then they've been in the collection of the rooms. So,
and the rooms is?
The rooms is the Provincial Art Gallery, Museum, and Archives in St. John's, Newfoundland.
Okay. Can I ask you about? So the condition of the teeth was something you mentioned to me earlier, mm-hmm. and also the items that were found. What did they imply or suggest?
Yes. So the teeth were in immaculate condition, so they didn't have any cavities. They're very strong, and so that suggested certain things to the archaeologists and the osteologists, people who examine bones. They suggested that he must have had a good diet, right? Because a lot of that was an era, I guess, where they would eat hardtack, like flour and water, and it's very hard and breaks off your teeth and stuff like that. And people would have gingivitis because they didn't have enough vitamin C and stuff. But anyway, his teeth were in very good condition, so they can make certain assumptions about maybe what stature he might have had. But it's all conjecture, right?
Did we say what year they thought he was from?
They figured that because based on the uniform he was wearing, that probably about 1800.
Okay.
Right, but he was found in 1987. So things have advanced greatly since that time, right?
Right.
But they could only go by what they knew at the time,
right?
And so basically he's in the collection at the rooms.
But they know he's a sailor?
They assume he's a sailor from the uniform he was wearing. He's also buried with something that's called a marlin spike, which
Okay.
is like a wooden tool that sailors would use to make knots.
Okay.
You know, he's wearing a wool hat. He had a knife that had W.H carved into the handle of the knife, and he had W carved into the sole of his shoe.
I was curious about the coffin because I thought, that seems like a really nice coffin for. Was there something special about the coffin? Did people say that?
I don't
no?
really know much about the coffin
Right.
other than it was a wooden coffin, and that it was also because it was buried oriented east. They were making some assumptions about the fact that maybe he was Muslim. They were, because they said this was unusual for an early Christian burial for the coffin to be oriented east. But I've since learned, of course, that a lot of Africans in the New World, when they died, they wanted to be buried facing Africa, right? So.
So we surmise that he's a black seaman, and this is not unusual for the time at all, which a lot of people don't realize. So can you talk about black seamen at that time, what they, just how prevalent they were, really, how much they contributed to the overall culture, what was that, and what they contributed to the black diaspora?
Yeah, so I didn't really know, I wasn't aware of this myself either. Like, I learned about W.H. when I was doing... preparing to curate this exhibition at the Rooms. So I did a residency there, and I was looking, they took me behind the scenes on looking at all kinds of items that they have in their collection, items from merchant ships that sank in the late 1700s and things like that. And then one day the conservator mentioned, oh, by the way, we have the remains of this young guy. The hair kind of stood up on me.
Yeah, man.
And they gave me an article to read, and I've lost my train.
No, I do that all the time. But listen, what I'm thinking about is this. He was a sailor, and that just wasn't unusual.
Yes. So
and I don't think a lot of people know that.
Yeah. So what I did at the time, then I started to read because I wanted to, and I thought, it would be good to. I don't want to show his skeletal remains, but the items that he was buried with in the exhibition to kind of complicate our thinking about that era, right? So what I learned was that about 25% of the British and American Navy were black, right? And that they were seamen on these boats, these vessels. They, as I say in the poem, they helped to carry ideas. They heard what was happening here and there, and they carried that about, people like Frederick Douglass, people like Olade Equiano, who was... had been enslaved and then, struggled to gain his freedom and then became an
telling me about slave narratives.
Yes.
So many of the earliest slave narratives are the stories of sailors?
Yeah, exactly. About 6 of these autobiographies have all been of sailors.
I mean, just think how incredible it is. It's like when I found out about black cowboys. Like a third of the cowboys were black. That they were called cowboys in the first place, boys. So there's so much that we just don't know.
Exactly.
And it's infuriating. It's absolutely infuriating. Talk a little bit more about that exhibition that inspired this book. It's called What Carries Us?
Yes.
Talk about that.
Yeah, so that exhibition was looking at the links between Newfoundland, Africa, and the Caribbean. And so I included, the exhibition was shown alongside the work of John Akumfra, who is a British Ghanaian filmmaker, artist, and he did this epic work called Vertigo Sea that sort of looks at, it's a 3-channel video where you're seeing scenes of ocean life, and all these mammals and birds, etc. Okay. You're also seeing all the vessels, and you're sort of seeing, it's about, man's intervention in terms of slavery and ocean life, whaling, all that kind of thing. So my work was shown alongside that. I was invited to do an exhibition that reflected on that work, and so I pulled one thread from that work, and that was about slavery in the Middle Passage. There's at one point in that work where it talks about Bonavista, 1497, which is when John Cabot supposedly discovered the New World, right? And so I decided to look at how Newfoundland related to that work. I invited 4 contemporary women artists to be included in that exhibition.
Is one of them here today?
One of them, Sandra Rooster,
Yes.
Camille Turner, Sonia Boyce, and a Montreal-based artist named Shelley Miller. So all of their work kind of intersected with those themes for me, and as well I included some archival objects. So W.H.'s remains, some items from a merchant ship that sank in 1789. So to kind of show you that at the same time that Newfoundlanders were, struggling, really as peasant class, and then our ancestors were enslaved in the Caribbean. You had this merchant class, which was kind of looking for the finer things in life, the china and the wine bottles and all that kind of stuff. And I also included molasses barrels from the turn of the century, examples of ballast. So 19 slave ships were built in Newfoundland and Labrador that were used to transport human cargo.
Just imagine that, 19 slave ships.
19 slave, yes.
Yeah.
Something that I didn't learn about until more recently.
Random, yeah.
And so ballast, these were displacement vessels, right? So they would be filled with ballast, and they'd make their journey across the ocean, and then that ballast would be let go on the coast of the West African coast, and people would be carried on board, right? So Camille Turner reflects on that in her work. And so that was the kind of story I was trying to tell. And then in terms of what carried us, I'm talking about the British philosopher Paul Gilroy, his work where he's talking about the Middle Passage. So what were the languages, cultures, ideas, art forms, practices that Africans carried with them to the New World? Yeah.
Thank you. Tell me about that. You sound so incredibly knowledgeable, and I know that a work like this can only come into such force of being because you've done your research, you've done your work, and it allows the creativity to take place. So can you talk about some of the research you did for this book, and perhaps for your exhibition as well? Yeah,
so this has been an ongoing project. So to read about, to go into the archives and see what exists in the archives or what doesn't exist in the archives.
What's the ongoing project?
So the ongoing project was about, and it all started with wanting to, I grew up in Newfoundland and Labrador, which, is a remarkable place if anybody gets an opportunity to visit there, a very unique place within this country. But, I grew up in an era where my history was not reflected. It was always, my siblings and I were always the only black child in our class, didn't have any teachers or role models, there. And, so you kind of feel a sense of erasure, a lack of belonging. So when it became time for my family to leave that place, it became important for me to kind of make some connections and feel more rooted in the place. And so I started to do research. I started looking at artists whose work really, to me, spoke to that connection. And also reading folk art, work of people, all kinds of folks who are reflecting on that history. So
I didn't even know people were. You're really the only person I know that was really reflecting on that. It's just eye-opening, and you're like an explorer yourself. It's just absolutely thrilling that what's happening here, and you've initiated it. So thank you for that. What I was saying before, when we started out, was that this is such a beautiful book. And I literally have to keep forcing myself to remember it's a children's book. Even look here, it's all these grown-ups are completely wrapped, right?
I think there's one or two children. There's a couple children here.
Okay. But that's because it really feels that it speaks to children. The best work does that, right? It can speak to children, it can speak to any age. And definitely that's what you've achieved with this. But you are known as a visual artist. And I really didn't, and I'm very familiar with your images. I'll know if it's you, right? So I was just surprised that I just didn't know that you could write like this. You're a very talented writer. You're a very talented writer. So I'm just wondering, how did you decide? No, tell me a little bit about the journey of writing this book, and how did you decide how you were going to tell it, and how did it end up to be such a beautiful prose poem?
So I mentioned that Marnie Parsons had gotten in touch and invited me to
Right.
do a piece about the exhibition. And at first I wasn't so interested because I was like, I did the piece about, I did the exhibition and let me look at other things. And I was working on something sort of semi-autobiographical,
Right.
a Newfoundland childhood. And then one day I was just sitting there and I think I'd been listening to some dance hall or something, I don't know, rhythmic. And then I don't know from whence you came. I don't know your rightful name.
That just popped into your
That
head?
just came to me like fully formed, like the first two stanzas of the poem came to, and I was like, what? And then I wrote them down. But I kind of, yeah, I do believe in ancestral memory.
Absolutely.
I do believe that this was, I couldn't stop thinking about W.H. after meeting him in this exhibition, through this exhibition, and was always there present in my back, in the back of my mind. So I read a really interesting book called African Americans in the Age of Blackjacks, African Americans in the Age of Sail by an American historian, W. Jeffrey Bolster. I really encourage everybody to read it because it's very accessible and a really interesting read, and just talks about the role of these men, primarily men in that age of sail, the 16th and 19th century, right? And so it just, the poem, those first two stanzas came to me, and I just, then I did research, and I wanted to make sure that I was answering the question. First I thought, well, I could try to write something, but first of all, my imagination is not that rich. I don't, I've never sailed across the ocean. I don't know what the life of a sailor is like. These men have written their own autobiographies, but what I have are questions. So, who were you? Where were you from? And so once I started posing questions of myself, that it just seemed to flow.
What was your routine? I just have to ask. Did you get up in the morning until this was done, sit down at your desk, go right to your desk?
I think I had my iPhone, so I just kind of jot some stuff in my
Like
phone.
in the middle of your day?
It might be in the middle of the day. It might be on the streetcar. It might be sitting in the park or late at night.
How long did it take?
It did not take me very long to write the poem itself. Right. Maybe a couple of weeks.
What? Yeah. Okay. Okay. I'm probably sorry I asked that. Okay. I didn't. Now I'm a bit lost. Okay. Let me see. So you talk about these questions that you pose, and what I love so much about these questions is they really do suggest possible lives, and there is this tendency for us, even today, we're frustrated at the kind of narrow representation of Black people often, Sometimes we do it ourselves, And, but all these questions you ask of W.H. Saylor's life lets us know just how many things it could have been, just how broad it could have been. He could have been this, he could have been that. And I find that, what were some of the Black experiences of that time, or just that you wanted people to be open to realizing that Black people had?
Well, the fact that he could have been from Africa, he could have been from the Caribbean or the American South, he could have been from Nova Scotia, and if he was from Nova Scotia, he might have been, there as a result of the American Revolutionary War. I wanted to sort of hint at what that history was. They were promised land, and when they got there, the land was, the crappiest land, that they had to then kind of struggle to cultivate. So I wanted to kind of hint at what some of these possible histories may have been.
Right. You talk about Haiti.
I talk about Haiti and that, the role that these sailors had in bringing these ideas of democracy and freedom, abroad,
I love that you also talk about, did you have any kids?
Yes.
Why do you go there?
Because that's the other thing, which was really important to me. The fact that DNA technology has changed, dramatically since the late 1980s. And what I learned from speaking to somebody that I know who's an archaeologist, where they were saying, through mitochondrial DNA, we can tell where somebody, not just where they're from, but where they might, not just who their people were, but maybe even where they spent the first 14 or so years of their life. Because it's in your marrow, right? What you ate, right?
I didn't know
and
that.
so it's possible that with if they examine those remains now, they'll be able to find out who his people are and maybe even where he grew up. And if there are living relatives, then maybe they'd like to know about them. My vision is that he, as I say in the book, that he would receive a dignified reburial, that we'll all gather on the coast and, and give him and put him to rest again and put a marker at the site.
Yeah, lovely. The questions, the way that you pose them, and one of the reasons why this book is so moving is there's a certain intimacy, poignancy, there's curiosity, huge curiosity, which always, which is very stimulating to the reader. But also there's just this intimacy and poignant, you're almost crying from your own heart, it feels like. You're crying out from your own heart. And in a way, it feels to me like you could be asking questions for all of us. You could be asking questions for yourself. And so, can you talk to us and share? Because you do mention some really interesting parts about your own, not in the book itself, but you do mention sometimes in other work I've seen, other introductions to catalogs, etc. You will talk about your great-grandma and the first woman in your family to come from Africa. Can we share some of that?
So yes, at one point my mother shared having a foremother named Sissa who made the Middle Passage when she was an adolescent. And that's all we really...
Your mom is Jamaican?
My mother's from Jamaica, yes. I'm born and raised in Jamaica and came to Canada in the late 50s, mid-late 50s. And so she talked about, she grew up with her grandmother, her great-grandmother. She knew, her history, that history, which I didn't necessarily have growing up in Newfoundland. But when I learned about those ships that were built there, I thought one of them in particular, the first one I learned was called the Sarah, and it was built in the late 1700s, and it made 3 trips. It made a trip, to first they would go to Liverpool and to be outfitted, and then they were and insured, and then they would go on to West Africa and to Jamaica. So it made 3 of these trips before it sank off the coast of Jamaica. So then I thought to myself, wow, what if she made that her trip to Jamaica on the Sarah, on one of those ships that were built in Newfoundland?
A possibility.
It's a possibility.
Yeah. Okay. One thing that really makes everything so powerful is that, you're not the kind of person that just says, or writer, that just says, okay, this is the history. And there's a way to really, it's an unfortunate way to keep mainstream history kind of separate from Black history, but it's not, obviously it's not, right? So what you really do is, for me, is just, you make a point of filling in gaps. You make it make sense, because, obviously a lot of what we learn doesn't make any sense, right? But you make it make sense. And I want to talk about your desire to do that and the ways in which you do that. Is that a tough one? Or?
Yeah, I think I want it to be made accessible in a way that I can have a conversation with my mother or, and other relatives, friends, anybody, and that they can relate to this history, right? So that's important to me.
About the illustrations, because they are so. Here we have one of the beautiful illustrations. But anyways, what I wanted to know over here, what I wanted to ask you was, it's so distinct from your general style, and I was just curious about that. It's to me, like you're underwater, you're in the water. It's a watery, dreamy, underwater experience that I get anyways. And I wanted to know what inspired you to do it that way, because it's different from what you would normally do. And what did you want us to feel?
Yeah, I did want you to feel what it might feel like to be from his vantage point on the boat looking out into the into the ocean or into the mist, into the depths.
The animals.
Into the animals. And this is what you see in the book only represents a bare fraction of the the work that I did.
Really? What do you mean by that?
Well, because you can't. The form is limits you to the 32 pages of a picture book. But I did any one of these drawings that you see. There's 10 more of them, right? So. Yeah, I looked at archival photographs. I looked at, art historical paintings. I looked at film stills. I looked at all kinds of. I used my imagination to create the images. Yeah.
Okay, this is my last. Is it my last question? And then you guys can ask some questions. But let me just make sure. Yeah. Okay. So, as I was saying, what really thrills me so much about this work that you're doing. On the Black Atlantic and on the ties between the Caribbean, which my parents are from as well, and Newfoundland. And I suppose, I don't know, I'm probably repeating myself already, but I suppose what I'm thinking is that you first of all, you're bringing something vast and huge. It's a huge area of scholarship that you've really opened up. I mean, it's huge. People are just leaping in. It speaks so much to this experience, and it's enormous. And that's really important to me that people are aware that you've opened this up. And I guess I want you to make sure you get the credit for that because I really think it's huge. But I also think that it's so fortuitous that it's you, because who else can do this? Mm-hmm. You have your dad's Nigerian, your mom's Jamaican, you grew up in Newfoundland, and who else, your family embodies this experience like virtually no one else can. Mm-hmm. And so we're so blessed that you are the one to give it to us from this personal space. And so my final question to you is, talking about your history, Nigerian, your heritage, Nigerian, Jamaican, Newfoundland. Can you talk about what that identity is? That Black Newfoundland identity that really you and yours are the ones to define, at least for yourself. And I mean, it's such a distinct place in this country with no other culture like it in the country. And distinct landscape, and it's just an unusual. And for you to, what is that to you? How has that experience shaped your identity?
Yeah, so I'm still working on that, right? That experience of growing up in that particular era. Because if you go to St. John's now, for example, the Black community has sort of burgeoned, and I'm like, wow, this, there's lots of people. I don't know if it's because the tuition at Memorial University is so affordable. It's one of the cheapest in the country. But, there are a lot of people there, and they're studying, and they're teaching, and they're really, they've decided to stay. Yeah. But, it's a rocky, windswept, rain and fog swept place in the middle of the North Atlantic, right? So I feel like the ocean is in my body, and the silence and the brooding silence of that place is sort of in my body, right? So no matter where I go in the world. And at the same time, though, I'm often, as many of us, I sort of don't really use unsettled, because we're not, and maybe that's the sort of perennial immigrant Canadian experience, that being first generation or second, but neither betwixt or between, right? Mm-hmm. You feel that. Not fully of the place, but not necessarily tied to these other places.
Do you feel not fully of the place
because
you're not reflected?
Not because I'm not reflected. So doing that work was about claiming that for myself, right? Okay. And claiming that for that generation that will come after me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was just a wonderful. Thank you so much. Are you going to ask? Is somebody going to moderate the audience questions? Fury? Yeah, okay. Sure here.
Hi, everybody. So we're going to be taking questions for Bushra. If you have any questions,
Donna?
you just raise your hand and I'll come to you. And okay, 1, 2. Please keep it short and sweet as best as you can. I'll come. Okay. There you go.
Oh, Bushra, thank you so much for this beautiful book. The images are so beautiful.
Thank you,
It made me
Danielle.
think of like how he's probably one of thousands of other sailors. I'm wondering what was the most satisfying part of this process? Like, what was it for you?
That's a really great question. I think to see the book when it finally comes in the mail, you're like, oh my goodness, like, like this really is, all this work has come together, the text and the images and, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Bushra, Maddie. Wow, this is really amazing. And listening all the stories and poem from you, it's even more enlightening. And of course, absorbing all this history is the most important. Like we are all so ignorant, okay? So this is actually a superb contribution. But I'm also thinking of this sailor that, first of all, he was so young, 22 years old. As a sailor, you start wondering when he started sailing. On the other hand, being discovered in a coffin, by the shore, obviously through the erosion, and learning that he was in a coffin, buried in a certain way, buried with certain object, it feels, for me, dignifying. And the most important thing, and this is not a question, but the amazement of creating is like you picking up the story from the shelf of an archive, which is even more important because it's as important as the people that found that coffin lying on the shore and called the archaeologist. So you're kind of giving a second chance of this sailor through putting this book and bringing us to us. So thank you so much.
Thank you for that. And you made me, Maddie, think, remind me about something that I didn't say, is that now the institution has decided that they're going to re-examine the uniform, like some of the fibers in the uniform, and also the physical remains to see if they can learn what more they can learn about it. So, yeah.
One question over here.
Hi, Bushra. Thank you very, very much for this amazing, amazing
Oh,
book.
thank you.
I have a question about the structure of the book, which I believe is incredible. First of all, I want to thank you for the incredible illustrations. But I want to just talk about the structure of the book in terms of the background to timeline, that really important learning tool at the back. Just wanted to find out a bit about how you came to shifting, to including this kind of material in the context of a children's book.
I thought it was vital to include that information, and would like to also shout out a couple of people in the room. My dear friends, Erica Simmons and Barbara Brockman. Barbara's a teacher in the Ontario system, and so just talking about how important it was to make this, enliven this for teachers so that they can continue to use it as a resource. I don't know, Barbara, if you want to say anything about that at all, but.
Hi, I rarely get a group to listen to me, so I really appreciate this. Yeah, so Bushra shared with me about the ideas that she had in the book. Fantastic. This is what Ontario schools need. And they need the historical information in a story form before the kids get to learning their Canadian history, which is about... So this book actually was used this week in my classroom for students doing the Heritage Fair projects. And 2 girls did their project on enslavement in Canada and asked questions about that. And I was able to give them this book as a resource to talk. And they talked, in her presentation, she talked about Newfoundland and Canada being part of the triangle trade. And that came from Bushra's book. I hadn't heard anyone of my former students, even though they were introduced to the ideas, use that piece of knowledge. And so to just say that, yeah, Canadian kids need these stories in story form way earlier than when it's taught historically, so that when they come to the historical aspect, the story piece is already there. It's kind of like, oh, and they know the story, and so it's put into another context, and they get their knowledge in a kind of a layered sense. So this is Bushra's first historical book, I'm saying, and I'm hoping. And so thank you for giving me this chance, Bushra. So proud of you.
Thank you. Yeah. So I've tried to include questions that teach, both that will touch on different points in the curriculum. So whether it's geography, it's social science, it's history, it's language arts, different aspects that they can look at. Also, additional sources of reading, and then I've also tried to fit, in terms of the timeline, what was happening at different points in history and what was happening in Atlantic history.
So we have one more question. We'll take one more after this person, and then you can ask Bushra more questions after. Thank you.
Hi, Bushra. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I think you and I have talked before about this process, but I'm really touched by the conversation because something showed up for me where I think we talked about Nigerian thinker Bayo Akomolafe and how he talks about what he's more interested in is not how we find place, but what we give up in the search to belong. And I think that for me, listening to the conversation, it's not just your journey, but also the figure of a sailor. It opens up this question and a crack about, being from away, so to speak, and all of us in some ancestral way, except for Indigenous people here, are from away. So for me, what's important is that you're opening up the question of what we give up to belong. And do we need to? In the way that we have been seeking it. So thank you.
Thank you, Coleman.
Thank you. Okay. You have a question? Actually, after this, we can still take more questions, so feel free to get ready.
Oh, sure. Hi, Bushra.
Hi, Amy.
Very quick and maybe unformed question. I found the most powerful thing in the book was this moment when you say you claim him. That really brought me to tears. And hearing you today, especially towards the end of the conversation, when you said you still don't feel like you fully belong, now I gather this is probably like the most also autobiographical bit, maybe, that in a way, like, we all want to belong, we all want to be claimed. And you've done this beautiful, beautiful gesture for this unknown man. So I don't know if it's a question, but feel free to respond. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think it comes in waves. There's days that you feel you belong, and then other days that you don't. You know, like if I go to Newfoundland now, I was thinking about the last time I was there, actually the time before last, 2019, and I was staying at this guest house with a good friend, and the owner of the guest house, you know, came in the morning because she hadn't seen us the night before, and she bounded over to us with great enthusiasm, and she said, "Where are you from?" And when I said, I just made a point of saying, I'm from St. John's with the biggest, you know, and the look of disappointment on her face, right? Like, because she just couldn't, you know, she was so prepared to welcome this, you know, this come from away, right? And so that to me is emblematic of she can't imagine that I'm, you know, when she thinks about a Newfoundlander, I'm not the vision that she has, you know?
Thank you. Any extra oh, here we go.
Just a question and also kind of like a statement. I think that other people who have seen the book as well have felt this. When I saw the book, I immediately wanted to respond to the emotion you evoked because of your process with choosing the colors. It literally washed me as soon as I felt the first opening of the page. Could you talk a little bit about the process of how you got to those moments where the mood of color and how you just brought us into this story? Because every time you turn a page, the colors are so vibrant, yet the mood of the book evokes so much emotion, and there's a consistency that you feel. You don't feel like, oh, this suddenly is surprising. You feel like sometimes you turn a page and you go, oh, and I'm just going into this beautiful moment of these waves of the colors in the story. If you could just talk about that process.
I think you said it all. Yeah, it's really, you know, that was sort of the intention, to have you feel that feeling of being kind of enveloped, you know, in that sort of ocean landscape, you know, with using kind of a relatively limited palette, you know, of blues and greens and browns and, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.